So welcome everyone to our session today. We're going to be focusing on strengthening compliance and looking at some single audit updates as well as some common pitfalls for our not-for-profit entities. And so just as an introduction, my name is Jimmy Romel. I'm an audit partner here with Max Lock and Ritter with a specialty in governmental and not-for-profit accounting as well as single audits. Along with me today is Veronica Day, who's a senior associate here at our firm. She also has quite a of extensive knowledge in not only not-for-profit audits, but also single audits. So the two of us will be going through the presentation today. Just to let y'all know, we do have a little bit of housekeeping up on the front end. You will see some polling questions that will come through during our presentation today. These are required for y'all to provide responses to, so that way for those of y'all who are looking to get CPE from our presentation, you'll be able to do so. This first one, just to let you know, you will be asked for your name and email. Also, if you don't already have your full name on your Zoom profile, please go ahead and try to make that update during the presentation, because that way we know exactly who you are, so we can make sure, once again, for CPE purposes, that we give everyone their required CPE that they're going to earn today. So I'll give everyone a couple, a little bit of time just to kind of answer that first question. And then once that's done, we'll go ahead and move on to our presentation. All right, so we're going to go ahead and kick off everything today. So as I mentioned, Veronica and I will be leading everyone through our session today. These are our faces in case you didn't see us on screen already, just to let y'all know, once again, we'll be leading today. If you move on to the next slide, this will be our agenda for our session. So as I mentioned on the front end, our focus today is going to be very much single audit related. So the first portion of our presentation is going to cover some single audit and uniform guidance updates. So there was some changes to the uniform guidance that were done in late 2024. As well as the uniform guidance, we're also going to focus on some changes related to Texas grant management standards, because a lot of times the state will kind of mirror what the federal agencies are doing as far as their updates. So for certain instances on our information, you'll notice that we will include both uniform guidance references as well as references to the Texas grant management system. Second part of our presentation today, we'll go through, which I think this is one of most of everyone's favorite topics that we cover, is common audit deficiencies. This just gives y'all some opportunities to kind of see what we have seen as part of our single audits, and hopefully provide some good information as far as what, if you're not already doing things, what is needed to potentially alleviate potential deficiencies in relation to your single audits. And then our last kind of portion of the presentation is going to be related to effective grantor communication. This is also just more of a insight from us as far as maybe some best practices in relation to how to communicate with your granting agencies, because a lot of times there is a lot of frustration and some issues when it comes to getting the information you need from your contacts at your grantor agency. So we're going to kind of address some of those topics as well. And then lastly, at the end, we'll have some Q&A, but feel free during our presentation today, if you do have a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat. We will try to address as many of those questions as we can, either during the presentation or once again at the end. If there are any questions that we aren't able to get to, or maybe just need to do a little bit more research to provide a better answer, we will definitely make sure we follow up with anybody who provides a question, so that way we'll make sure all those get addressed. And so, as I mentioned, the first part of our presentation today will cover some single audit and uniform guidance updates. So this first slide, hopefully, is one that everyone was looking forward to as part of the updates. The uniform guidance, as well as the Texas grant management standards, have increased the threshold for the requirement of a single audit. As y'all know, currently the threshold for both the federal and state single audit requirements is if you have expenditures in excess of $750,000. So with this change, that bump will be now to $1 million, both on the federal and state. And as a reminder, those are individual. So your federal and your state, you have to take those individually to determine whether or not a federal single audit or a state single audit is needed. So this is effective though for fiscal years that are beginning October 1st, 2024 and later. So the first set of entities that will get this relief is going to be entities with a fiscal year end of September 30th, 2025. So I know some of y'all may either be calendar year ends or maybe potentially June or August year ends. So depending on your year end, just make sure that you're aware for this either during the current audit season or your upcoming audit season, be aware of kind of what that threshold is. Because once again, if you're beyond 9/30/2025, then a new threshold bump takes effect. If you're not, we'll still be using the $750,000 as our threshold. In addition to the overall threshold, kind of very much in the same way the last time they updated the threshold, your major program threshold also is being increased from $750,000 to $1 million. So hopefully, once again, that will give some entities potential relief in regards to even needing a single audit, but also maybe taking some programs that historically maybe have been considered to be a major program and maybe moving those down to what's known as a type B program. And then also, I know we probably don't have a ton of our clients that have expenditures in excess of 25 million or 34 million, but if you do, just know for major program determination, it used to be if you were above 25 million, you would multiply your expenditures times 3%, and that would be your major program threshold. With this new guidance, it's now if you're above 34 million, you'll use the 3% multiplication by your expenditures to arrive at your threshold. Otherwise, you're still going to use the $1 million. All right, as far as effective dates for the uniform guidance updates. So this is where it can get a little confusing as far as what and when these new updates are actually effective. So essentially, any new award you're getting from a federal agency or a pass-through entity that's received after October 1st, 2024, will have the new uniform guidance that we'll discuss today. Those will be effective for those awards. So if you have any awards that are before October 1st, 2024, then those will actually still be subject to the old set of regulations under uniform guidance. So potentially, for your upcoming audit season, you may have instances where you have two awards for one program and they may be subject to different requirements. Now, having said that, the federal agencies have been encouraged to potentially apply those revisions to either amendments that are made after October 1st, 2024, any existing awards that extend beyond fiscal year 25, maybe potentially pushing that new guidance to those awards. And then also the expectation is that when you're getting these award agreements, if you see or don't see any specific statements in there regarding which set of uniform guidance standards apply, it's definitely recommended to make sure to reach out to your granting agency to confirm what set of standards are applicable to the awards that you guys are receiving. And as I mentioned, if you're receiving a fund through a pass-through entity and not through or directly from a federal agency, those pass-through entities also must amend their subawards to reflect the changes related to the 2024 uniform guidance revisions. And then last thing is a pass-through entity cannot apply the 2024 revisions to a subaward if the federal agency has not applied the revisions as well. So there are instances where specific agencies may have a delay in implementing these new updates to the uniform guidance. So once again, it's really imperative for awards that you receive or even existing awards to really confirm with those granting agency contacts that you have as far as which of the standards actually apply, whether it be the old guidance or the new guidance. So now having said that, now we're going to go into some actual updates that were made in relation to the uniform guidance. This is definitely not a full comprehensive list of everything that was changed, but we tried to focus on the areas that maybe would be of most significance to our audience today. Obviously, a lot of the things that were changed, some are definitely a little bit more significant than others. Some are more clarifying language. So as we're going through these slides, I'll definitely try to point out whether or not any of these items are more significant or not, or whether or not it's merely just a clarification that was used or made during these updates. So the first one we'll talk about has to do with internal controls. As everyone is aware, you are required to have and maintain effective internal controls to provide assurance that you're managing a federal grant award under compliance with the grant award. And so that hasn't changed. What did change is they added in specific language in the uniform guidance to note that your internal control policy and procedures needs to make a reference to cybersecurity or other measures to safeguard internal control and information that's being used in these federal programs. So a lot of y'all may already have this as part of your policies and procedures, but if you don't, definitely go back in and make sure that you have potential cybersecurity risks or issues identified in your policies, because as we know, a lot of stuff that we do now definitely goes through various systems. And so cybersecurity is always a concern for potential fraud or other potential issues that could come about when it comes to not only that, but also maybe having people's individual information being subject to risks. So that's why I think the uniform guidance was kind of making sure that every entity really addresses this in their policy. So that way cybersecurity is kind of front of mind when it comes to developing your internal control policies and procedures. The second item on this slide talks about equipment. So hopefully this will provide a little bit of relief to our entities that actually purchase equipment with grant funds. So as a reminder, equipment is basically a tangible asset that has a useful life over a year. Under the old guidance, that threshold for what was considered to be equipment, if it had a useful life greater than 1 year, also had to be above $5,000 per unit. So what this change is doing is actually increasing that threshold from $5,000 to $10,000. Now, having said that, if your internal capitalization policy is less than 10,000, then that is what you would use as far as determining whether or not something is considered to be equipment or not. But it is bumping up that threshold in regards to what you would consider to be equipment, not only for possible capital asset type items, but also in regards to when it comes to disposition of those assets or those items once a federal program is done. And so having said that, mentioning disposition, now, under previous guidance, if you're excelling or, disposing of equipment, you still would always want to make sure, and still the case with the new guidance, you still want to ask either the passer entity or federal agency for specific disposition instructions, because they may have something that is a little bit different than what the generic language in the uniform guidance states. But just kind of overall, though, what it basically does is now instead of if you're granted access or ability to dispose or sell of that equipment once it's no longer needed for any program, it used to be anything above $5,000 would require that a portion of those proceeds that were obtained from that disposition to actually be remitted back to either the passer entity or the federal agency. So now under the new guidance, the amount is bumped up similar to the overall threshold. It's bumped up to now $10,000. And then just to point out that that same change for both the equipment threshold and disposition threshold also was changed in Texas grant management standards for any state awards. That threshold now has also gone from 5,000 to 10,000. And then lastly, supplies. Basically, that's anything that's not meeting the definition of equipment. So those items that are below that threshold, again, is also bumped up from 5,000 to 10,000 in relation to when you are trying to dispose of unused supplies that were acquired with grant funds. All right, so now focusing on some changes in relation to some of the procurement standards. So nothing overly significant here, but just want to point out a few things. The first item, it talks about competition. Previously, there used to be a requirement that you could not use geographic preferences as part of your kind of bid process unless there was an applicable federal statute or other mandate that would allow you to do that. So that has now been removed. So hopefully, once again, this will allow entities have a little bit more flexibility in regards to which types of vendors they're seeking in regards to procurement. For the middle section, in regards to methods, a small change. So now you'll see instead of something being referred to as a small purchase, that's been now changed to a simplified acquisition. And as a reminder, kind of the methods and thresholds for those procurement purchases, you have your micro threshold, which is basically can be as low as 10,000, can be as high as 50,000. And then your small purchases, which is now your simplified acquisition. And that's anything between 50,000, well, I guess anything between your micro threshold and what's the simplified acquisition threshold, which is normally $250,000. So that's just a clarification in regards to some language that they're using in relation to those types of purchases. And then also, you've historically always needed to document the amount of quotations that's deemed adequate in regards to making sure you've done proper procurement of items. So they've added some clarification in the uniform guidance to essentially say you can exercise judgment in determining the number of quotations which is adequate. I know historically, kind of best practice was usually three was kind of the best practice, but I know a lot of times, depending on what type of item you're trying to procure, sometimes three may not be enough. Sometimes three may be too much. So they added some language in there to basically allow for some clarification in regards to what is considered to be an adequate number of quotations on a procurement action. And then lastly, so there's a stipulation in uniform guidance. If you have a procurement that exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000, you are required to perform what's called a cost or price analysis, which is essentially just an estimating what you think something should cost prior to actually seeking bids or proposals in relation to that. So the change there was under the old guidance, you had to negotiate profit as a separate element of that overall price estimate or contract cost, whereas now that's no longer required. So you still have to perform a cost or price analysis, but the profit element of that analysis is no longer required as part of your procurement action. All right, you should have seen a poll, and I'll kind of keep going on. These next three just kind of talk through some information in regards to subrecipient and contractor determinations. This is always one that seems to be a little confusing because a lot of times what someone deems to be a subrecipient versus what somebody deems to be a contractor can get very gray very quickly. And so just know that it's ultimately the passer entity's responsibility on a case-by-case basis to determine whether or not an entity is actually a subrecipient or a contractor. And there is a lot of language in 200-331 in the uniform guidance that kind of gives you some examples of what, basically if something would be more likely a subrecipient and also when instances when someone would likely be a contractor. So definitely, if you don't know that guidance overly well, I encourage you to definitely look through that and just make sure you understand the differences between the two, because obviously it can make a big difference, not only in your audits, but also just in some compliance requirements that you may have as part of those pass-through awards that are given out. The next one actually is probably a little bit more of a significant change. There's now a requirement now for a pass-through entity before awarding a grant to a subrecipient to verify that that subrecipient is not suspended, debarred, or otherwise excluded from receiving federal funds. And usually the best way to do that is on sam.gov. I know Veronica is probably going to touch on it as part of her session, but I know a lot of times, even when that analysis is done, a lot of times that support to basically prove that you went to sam.gov to verify that an entity is not suspended or debarred isn't always maintained. So definitely make sure as part of this process that not only you visit sam.gov and verify if a subrecipient is suspended or debarred or not, but also have the support, because that's something that's definitely going to want to be looked at as part of the overall either audit process, or even if you have a granting agency coming in to review some things. And then lastly, when it comes to, and I don't know how many folks on here actually give fixed amount subawards, but if for some reason your entity does do that, just know that that threshold now has been increased from $250,000 to $500,000, but still requires prior written approval of a federal agency prior to actually making those awards. All right, so as far as costs, there used to be more items that were included in the prior written approval section of the uniform guidance, as far as it may needing some additional approval prior to incurring those costs. So the items listed on the slide here are the areas that they removed, either because it wasn't applicable or because there wasn't definitive, information on why those items should be included as something that does require prior written approval from an agency. But just know that even though they are removing things, it's always a good idea to make sure you understand which costs as part of your grant agreements do require specific prior written approval before incurring those costs, because what you don't want is to incur a cost and then realize that it's not allowable because it wasn't given the proper approval prior to incurring the cost. So just know it's not probably a lot of areas that change significantly, but just know that it's always best practice to verify anything that needs prior written approval before incurring those costs related to a grant agreement. And then the next item in regards to indirect costs, this hopefully should be another one that provides some relief to a lot of entities. As y'all know, the current de minimis rate for indirect costs has been 10%. That's now bumping up to 15%. You can still negotiate a contracted rate with a pass-through entity or a federal agency. Federal agencies and pass-through entities still have to honor those basically negotiated rates that maybe some of y'all have done in the past. It can't require you to adopt a de minimis rate under this now 15%. So you can always use the 15% if indirect costs are allowed as part of a grant agreement. But just note that it's really not changing anything overly significantly other than just allowing entities to now, if they want to use the de minimis, to go from 10% to 15%. And so the last item in regards to this first section we're covering today is, as y'all know, as part of the audit process, we rely on the Office Management Budget to provide their compliance supplement, which is what we use as part of the audit process to determine what programs are we're testing, what specific compliance requirements within a program are subject to audit. So the 2025 compliance supplement, which normally it would be out by June, July, maybe even sometimes August, unfortunately is still in draft form. They still have not released the final version. We don't anticipate there being a lot of significant changes to this version compared to the 2024 compliance supplement. The only, I think, main thing that's going to be different is, as I mentioned, because there is now a potential to have two different sets of uniform guidance applicable to federal programs. There's going to be information in this compliance supplement to basically provide guidance on if it falls under the old guidance, these are the requirements. If it falls under the new guidance, these are the requirements. But unfortunately, like I said, it's not currently finalized. We're hoping it's done soon because we rely on this information, and in most cases, we're not really even allowed to issue our final single audit report unless we have the final version that we can use as part of our audit process. So hopefully this will come very soon. They've been saying, the federal government's been saying this for, going on probably 2 months now that it's going to come out, but unfortunately it's still not out there. So we will definitely make sure everyone is aware once it does get finalized. So once again, but this is something that we will kind of keep an eye out for everybody in regards to when the final version is going to be released. And so that was all from the first section. So as I mentioned, our second section is going to be related to common audit deficiencies. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Veronica, who will take you through this section.
Thanks, Jimmy. So first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at frequent areas where we see exceptions in our single audit testing. So this is going to be on both the federal and the state side. And so this is really just to make you aware of these areas and how you can enhance your controls and also procedures as necessary. And we all know that single audit guidance is complicated, but hopefully some of these ideas will help simplify that process. So we will be going through 6 areas today. The first one that's listed on here is the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards, also known as the CFA. If you have state funding, then that would be known as the CISA. And so that is really the schedule that ends up within the audit report. And then the other 5 areas are specific compliance requirements that we're going to look at. So when your auditors are testing the major program that they've selected, they have 12 requirements that they need to look at to see if they are allowable or directed material. And these are the areas that we see that have the most exceptions in going through them. So that's why we're highlighting those. Now, for each of these sections that we're going to look at, we're going to be discussing what the requirements are, also what exceptions or deficiencies that we've seen. And then from there, we'll look at some ways to kind of prevent those going forward. So there are a lot of factors in determining how deficiencies are reported. This is done using judgment and on a case by case basis. But there are two main ways that deficiencies are reported that you'll see. The first one is a control deficiency. And so this is, when exceptions are not material, it is required to be communicated to management, and that's done verbally or through a listing that we provide of internal control observations. But this is something where it is not included within the actual single audit report. If you have deficiencies that are significant deficiencies or material weaknesses, then those will be included as a reportable finding within your single audit report. So there can be both compliance and internal control findings. And usually, if you have one, then you will have the other because we report both of those in our single audit report. And the finding will repeat until it's cleared. So if you had a finding in 2025, then your 2026 single audit report will also include that finding, but it'll have a status update to say whether the finding has been cleared or if it's still an ongoing process. But if you've cleared that finding, then in 2027, you would not have that finding listed. Now, also, if you are on the federal side, there is a data collection form that is submitted after the audit report. So if you do have a finding related to federal funds, then that will also be included in the data collection form. Okay, so let's turn to our first area, which is discussing the CFA. So, as I mentioned, this is the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. There are specific items that are required to be included in your report. And so, some of the common deficiencies that we see is that grant awards do not have they're not included on the correct schedule. So, they might be state funds, but they're reported on the federal side instead. And it's important to make sure that they are on the correct schedule because we use that as auditors in order to determine which programs that you have to test and that you have met the coverage area that you need if you're required to have a single audit. Also, new programs could also not be included on the CFA. And we've also seen incorrect identification numbers as well. Um, the CFA is usually reconciled, well, is supposed to be reconciled to the financial statements. So if that is not something that is done on an annual basis, then that could cause your new programs not to be included on there. So that's something that we want to make sure is done during the reporting process. So here are some tips to help prevent deficiencies. The first two kind of go together. Is that basically you could create a single audit CFA template. There are standard requirements of what needs to be included within your report. So where you have the name, the granting agency, you have the assistance listing number if it's federal funds, you have the amount that was expended, you have any pass-through entity numbers that are included in there. And if you pass down any funds to subrecipients, you need to include that as well. So knowing what those items are, you can just have a standard Excel document that lists all those categories to make sure that you have those complete. And then also you should probably have a CFA support file or some sort of folder that the program management as well as finance and accounting have access to. So then that way, as program management receives new awards, then they are able to kind of include that into the folder. So then whoever is preparing the CFA and updating that has the support to be able to document, which funding source is it, what grant identification numbers are there. Because as auditors, we come in and we're looking at the CFA, but we're also verifying the information that's included in there. And if we select the program as a major program, we will need to look at the contracts that were applicable during that fiscal year. So having it all together in one file just makes it easier to be able to pull that information to be able to verify it. You'll also want to, as I mentioned before, perform a reconciliation between grant revenue and the CFA. If you have revenue specifically for state and then for federal, you want to make sure that you reconcile it for those schedules so that if you have any grants where you don't have you have new grants and maybe there was only like a small amount, it started at the end of the fiscal year, you would still need to include that on your CFA. But if you're used to using a schedule that just has, what the grants were in the prior year, doing that reconciliation will help you identify if there are new programs that you need to include that you have recorded on the financial statement side, but you don't actually have those listed on the CFA. Also, we have here as the third bullet point is that if you're in accounting and finance and you're looking at these award agreements and you're trying to determine which schedule is it placed on, here are some like trigger or buzzwords that can help you in that process. You still are still subject to everything that is in that agreement. But if you're specifically trying to look for whether a grant is federal or state, you can look for some of these wording in there for uniform guidance is related to federal side and Texas grant management is related to the state side. Also, assistance listing number was the new wording for CFDA on the federal side. And so not everything is updated with the government on the federal side. So sometimes you will see award numbers still listed as CFDAs. So that's just one area that you can search. If you're unable to determine whether this is state funding or federal funding, or you have both listed within your agreement, you can't tell the separation, then you can reach out to the grantor and try and determine that because you want to make sure that you're following the appropriate guidance. All right, now moving on to the compliance requirements. The first one is allowability, which is probably almost always tested on any of the grants that we look at. And this is really in reference to your grant agreement where you're seeing this is what the purpose is for the grant, this is based on what you have budgeted, and also what your scope of work is. So some common deficiencies that we run into is that non-allowable costs are charged to the grant, or there's a lack of documentation of approvals from management for those costs. And then also missing documentation of review and approval for time and effort reporting, which is related to your payroll for split funded employees. So, some ways to help prevent this is that for all employees that are going to be making grant purchases, is that really they should be provided with or have access to what the grant guidelines are, as well as the budget for the program. Because then this way they're able to ensure that the costs are allowable and that they can also, in looking at them, if they have questions, they can go to the guidance or they can go to program management or the grantor to make sure that they can use those. Now, if you have an electronic system that has coding in the background where you can identify based on your account code which approvals will be needed in order to, allow that purchase to be made, this is something that would be very beneficial to do on the grant side. Is so that if it is coded to a grant, then it'll automatically go to program management so that they will be reviewing and approving, and then it's already in the system. You also want to be monitoring your spending. One way to be able to look at that is with the billing reports. That's generally done on a monthly basis. And so when you're looking at the billing reports, you have your budget categories in there and you can see, tracking on do you need to, reach out to the grantor because there's maybe some costs that are going to be starting to exceed some category line items, or then also you look at the detail of all the costs that are associated with it to see is there anything that sticks out? Maybe something that doesn't belong in there. Maybe there's sales tax included and you're like, well, why do we have that in there? So just different things where you might have questions about that. You can kind of get those resolved before you send the billing. Or also, if you see it after the fact, then you can have those conversations with the grantor to see how you can adjust that so that that's all taken care of within the fiscal year. And it's not something that the auditors are looking at after the end of the fiscal year. So then you have to figure out how to communicate with the grantor for any of those adjustments. And then also related to time and effort documentation is that if you have split funded employees where they're either working on multiple grants or they're working on one grant and then they have the rest of their cost is administrative and it's charged to the operating budget, is that you want to make sure that those costs that are associated with the grant, that is for earned time as opposed to budgeted time so that you're not um, saying that 10% of their time is going to be spent on the grant and charged. It has to actually be approved based on their hours that are worked. Now, moving on to procurement, and this is probably procurement and subrecipient monitoring are probably the two biggest changes that happened with uniform guidance. Like, if you remember, it used to be A133, and when it changed to uniform guidance, there were a lot of requirements that were put in place for these two. We will talk about subrecipient monitoring towards the end, but just to let you know, for procurement, you are required to have a procurement policy. There are specific requirements that are listed in uniform guidance and also Texas grant management standards on the state side that you have to include in that policy. And they also walk through all the methods and the information that Jimmy was talking about earlier today. But these are the references to uniform guidance. It's only a couple of pages if you want to print it out for these specific areas. So it's just important to be able to review that and see that you have that included in your procurement purchases. So some common deficiencies that we see is that the procurement policy doesn't include all of the required elements. Also, there might not be a procurement policy. Um, there's the procurement method wasn't followed correctly. So maybe that there weren't quotes that were set aside and for support for that purchase. There's also no documentation of the cost or price analysis that was performed. And this is what Jimmy was talking about earlier, where it's that estimation of what the cost is that you're going to meet incurring for that significant purchase. And so those are only for procurements that are over that significant, for that simplified acquisition threshold. And then also improper support for sole source justification. In the past, back with A133, some of the support that was used would be a affidavit from the vendor stating that they were considered to be a sole source. And then once uniform guidance became effective, that was determined through FAQs that that was not considered to be adequate support because really it's based on the organization making the determination that it's considered to be a sole source. So you have to document what your research was that you did, like how did you reach out in order to determine that this was considered to be a sole source. So looking at some ways to help prevent these deficiencies, um, at least there's two items on here for annually, and at least annually you should be reviewing your procurement policy against uniform guidance or Texas grant management standards. So this allows you to be able to see if there are any changes, and it's not that it changes all the time, but it does, and they make small edits. But there was a big change, as Jimmy had talked about, that was happening in October of 2024 that was effective at that time. So we just want to make sure that your policy is up to date with the new wording. And then also that you want to look at it internally to determine maybe you're doing something in practice that is not the way that it's written in the policy. So you want to also look at that to see if there need to be adjustments for that as well, because sometimes the policy was done at the beginning of when uniform guidance became effective, but really hasn't been changed, but you're doing it differently in practice. Also, if you have staff that are working on purchases, then they should be trained on knowing what the procurement policy is and also what the methods are and what support needs to be retained for those purchases. Um, so if you don't just have a procurement department or purchasing department, when you're looking at it, there's a lot of purchases that fall within that what used to be a small purchase, but now is a simplified acquisition purchase, where you're looking at it could be 10,000 to 250,000. And so if you have program employees that are making those purchases, then you want to make sure that they are getting however many quotes that you're expecting to see, and they have that documented, and that you retain that information. And so then also with any of the procurement methods that you use is that you want to retain that documentation with the purchase if you can. It is an easier way of looking at it that if you're gathering all the information together, you have the quotes, you're supporting that invoice of that was the purchase that you did, you have that all together so that when the auditors come after the end of the fiscal year and they're looking at it, then they can see all of that together. Because we have run into where employees are no longer there, there's turnover that has happened. And so then it takes a lot more work in order to determine what method was used or what was the support for that and to be able to compile all of that. So if you have the ability to be able to include all of your support for those purchases for that method that was used, then that's what you should be doing in your system. Also for, non-competitive purchases that you have, that's one of the methods. That's if you have like an emergency, if you determine it to be sole source, if the granting agency had previously approved it. If you create a checklist for those non-competitive procurements, then it's easier to follow to make sure that everything is listed, how it was determined that you were using that method. And then also for sole source, you can have in there what was the determination? Like, what was the process? Who did you reach out to in order to determine that it wasn't, that it was considered to be a sole source? And then you have program management review that and approve that so that you have all of that information retained to support the method that you chose. And then also, as we had talked about before this last bullet here, is that for procurements that are greater than that simplified acquisition threshold, is that you want to retain that cost or price analysis. So when you have that estimate or that budget of what you're expecting for that purchase to be, then you'll want to be documenting that, whether that's in a memo or whether that's sort of Excel that where you have the information. You just want to include that with your procurement information so that you have that because if those are selected, then that is something that we as auditors would be looking for. All right, moving on to suspension and debarment. And this is there's sort of like two prongs with suspension and debarment. So this relates to vendors and procurement, which is generally what people are aware of. But then also it relates to subgrantees, which was something that Jimmy had mentioned in his presentation as well. So for the subgrantee portion, we'll discuss that on subrecipient monitoring. So here we'll just focus a little bit more on the vendor side. But basically, the government is saying that they don't want you to contract with or make subawards with vendors or parties that have been suspended or debarred. So, as Jimmy had mentioned, is that this is where you would go to sam.gov on the federal side to be able to identify if your vendor has been suspended or debarred. The threshold for this is 25,000. So, if you have a vendor where you're entering into a contract that is over 25,000, you'll need to verify they haven't been suspended or debarred. And then also, if you have vendors where maybe you have micro purchases with them, so there's not an individual purchase over 25,000, but this is considered in the aggregate. So then you would compile all of that and then maybe you end up spending over 25,000 with them. Same thing as that you would need to see if they're suspended or debarred and have that documented. So some of the common deficiencies that we see is that there is no suspension or debarment check that was completed, or there's no support for that suspension and debarment check. Also, that the contract was entered into first, and then the check was done for suspension and debarment. And so you really want to do that in the beginning process so that you're not entering into the contract of somebody who's been suspended or debarred. And then also maybe the organization wasn't aware of the threshold or that there was an aggregate amount for some of the vendors. So some ways to help prevent these deficiencies is to when you're looking at sam.gov, then you can go ahead and take a screenshot. You want to make sure that you include the vendor name that has been searched and the result responses, and then also the date of when you are doing this. And then you can retain that screenshot either with the purchase, if it's a larger amount, or if it's a vendor that's going over that aggregate of 25,000, you could just have a folder that's like suspension and debarment, so that you just have those documented for yourself. Now, also, there is another way of doing that is that when you have larger agreements and you have contracts with vendors, you can include a clause that they are not suspended or debarred. And so that when the vendor is signing the contract, they are certifying that they haven't been suspended or debarred. So then in those situations, you don't have to do the check because the vendor is certifying that. Um, Also, in your procurement policy, to add in as one of the procedures that you have that suspension and debarment check, because then that'll help remind employees that are making those purchases that that needs to be reviewed. And then also during the year to kind of be able to monitor those vendors where you see maybe they're going to exceed that 25,000 and you need to go ahead and look at that suspension and debarment. There is also a separate website on the state side. So just be aware that if you have state funding for suspension and debarment, you'll want to check the state website as well, as opposed to just going to sam.gov. All right, reporting. So here the criteria is really, it's coming from uniform guidance, but it's very generalized. Usually in your audit report, I'm sorry, not your audit report, your award agreement, that in there you'll have specific identifications of what you need to do for reporting, whether there's annual reports, quarterly reports, maybe progress reports, billing reports. You'll have all of that information included. So some deficiencies that we have seen is that reports were submitted after the grant deadlines. Um, there wasn't support for extensions that the granting agency had provided the organization. Reports were not submitted, or there was a lack of documentation of the review of the report before actual submission. And that's because as we are testing all of these requirements, we test compliance, but we also have to test internal controls. So we have to make sure to be able to see verification support for those reviews. So here are some tips to help prevent these deficiencies is that when you receive your award and you look at all the reporting requirements, is that really getting together with program management and finance and accounting and understanding what all the reports are that are due, putting those on the schedule, knowing who's completing those, what the review timeline is, then that'll all assist you in being able to meet the deadlines. So that way you can be aware of it for vacations or for holidays, that you're able to keep that in track to meet those deadlines. Also, if you are receiving an extension from the granting agency, retain that email with your report support so that you have that to know that it was approved. If they are not sending an email and they are really just having contact, like conversations with you about it, then at least document that. So you have that, you have who it was that you were meeting with, what their title is, what the extension date was, so that that's a way for the auditors to be able to help find out that information on the reporting extension. Then also, something to be aware of is that if you are submitting the reports electronically into their system, sometimes the system will have a date of when the report was submitted. However, if receive the report back or you have to resubmit it for another reason, that date, that original date, will sometimes be overridden by the resubmission date. So if that's happening, that you're going to have to resubmit, then at least take a screenshot of when you originally submitted the report because it's easier to have that documentation before you put the resubmission on there. And then also, you always want to have, when you're reviewing, is that if you have the internal review that's happening, if there's not formal sign-offs, because a lot of stuff is remote now, then maybe program management or whoever is certifying it or reviewing it, that they send an email that they've reviewed it and they've approved it. So then that information you can retain in the file to support that review process. And the last area here is on subrecipient monitoring. And I know this slide looks a little different from the others. There's a lot of words at the top, but I'm just, the three items that are the most important are the part that's underlined here, just to be really, it's those three categories that you're looking at. So the first one is related to the subaward and the information that's needed in there. The second one is that you have to evaluate the risk of the subrecipient. And then the third is that you have to perform monitoring for that subrecipient. So some of the common deficiencies that we see is that there is no risk assessment that was performed in advance of the subrecipient receiving the funding, that not all of the required items are included in the report, that there might be grant funding changes that were made that were not communicated to the subrecipients, and then also that the suspension and debarment check was not performed. So that's what we had kind of mentioned a little earlier, is that if you are um, awarding subawards that are more than 25,000, then you will need to verify that the subrecipient hasn't been suspended or debarred. And then some tips to help prevent these deficiencies. The biggest thing here is probably to create templates. So if you have an internal checklist for, just for your subrecipients, so these are the categories that you need to have for the required elements in order to be with uniform guidance. You also have the date of the risk assessment was performed, the date the suspension and debarment check was performed, and also the determination of what your monitoring activities are. That's really going to insist in the process that you have everything done for that subrecipient. You can create templates just for the risk assessment, for the award agreement. And then also, same thing as we were saying with procurement, is that you'll also want to check uniform guidance or Texas grant management standards and make sure that all of the required elements are included in there as well. Oh, and the last thing is that if you have changes to your agreements, your award agreements, you want to make sure to be able to send those down to the subrecipients, because the subrecipients don't have contact with the original granting agency. So they're not aware when there are changes that are taking place with the award. So you need to have a timeline in order to determine how you will be communicating those, to make sure that they are having everything on the correct schedules and they're following the correct procedures that they need to. Now turn it back to Jimmy.
All right, thanks, Veronica. So, as I mentioned, the last thing we're going to cover today is just some information on some things that would be helpful in regards to when you have to communicate with either a passer entity that's providing funds to you, or even a federal agency that maybe you're getting direct funding for. Because I know, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of times there's some frustration or definitely a lot of times delays in getting information that is needed. So this is not authoritative guidance by any means, just kind of some of our best practice recommendations in regards to how to go about making those communications in regards to getting the information that you need, not only for internal purposes, but also for audit purposes. So I think the biggest thing is always try to be as proactive as you can. I know historically, either clients or even when we've tried to reach out to some federal or passer entity contacts, you usually don't get responses overly quickly. So the sooner you can identify potential items, either for clarification or if you just need more information, definitely trying to reach out to those contacts and making sure also who the best contact is, because that isn't always provided or known as part of the grant agreement. So being as proactive as you can, because there's definitely a lot of information that maybe is either missing in a grant agreement or is vague, that definitely would need some clarification, not only, like I said, for internal purposes potentially, but definitely for audit purposes. So kind of the main things that we typically see in regards to making sure that you have these communications with a funding agency is the award type. So as Veronica mentioned as part of her presentation, a lot of times the grant agreement itself doesn't specify if it's a federal award, if it's a state award. because it can be one, it can be the other, it can be both, it could have some local component to it. So if it's not definitive in regards to having, an information that would make it clear as far as if it's federal or state or neither, then definitely making sure you're reaching out when you get any kind of funding agreement or funding letter from an entity to verify, is this something that potentially could be subject to single audit? And that kind of rolls into that second bullet on here is there also is instances where you may be getting funding from a federal or state agency that ultimately isn't subject to single audit. There is some funding instances where you're getting funding, but it's actually not subject to single audit. Now, in most cases, that's pretty much explicitly detailed on the funding agreement. But as I mentioned, it isn't always. So that's always something you want to make sure you verify. And then also kind of getting back to a little bit what I discussed earlier is making sure are you an actual subrecipient or are you a contractor? And making sure that you're aware when you're receiving funds, does the pass-through entity or federal agency or state agency consider you one or the other? Because obviously that has a big impact on whether or not a single audit maybe is required, or is if it's something that maybe requires at least the grant to be included on your CFA or your CFSA. And then also too, as you push down funding, making sure that those vendors are aware of whether or not they're considered to be a subrecipient or a contractor. The next item with clusters, this is usually easier on the federal side because with the OMB compliance supplement, there's just a lot more information in regards to what types of programs are considered to be clusters. Because as a reminder, for audit purposes, when something is deemed to have or deemed to be a cluster, when we test, we have to factor in all those programs that would roll into that cluster as one single program in regards to for testing purposes, both from a major program determination, but also just how we present it on the final report. So that once again isn't always clear. Definitely on the state side, there's some not always the best information in regards to whether or not something should be considered a cluster, because you may have two different awards from a state agency. They look like they're similar, but are they really? And so having that communication on the front end to verify if for their purposes they consider it to be one program for testing purposes would definitely be helpful. And lastly, as Veronica mentioned, a lot of the information that's included on the grant agreements don't always have the information that's needed for audit purposes. So it may not have an assistance listing number. It may not have an award or a contract number. And so once again, trying to be as proactive as you can to verify that information is available and ready. So that way, when we come out and actually perform the audits, you're not having to figure it out. Because as I mentioned, and of course now it's even amplified more with the government shutdown, you don't always get responses timely. And then also you don't always get responses in writing from these agencies. So there is some frustration in regards to making those communications. So the only thing I can just stress again is making sure to be as proactive as you can in regards to communicating with your granting agencies. And so with that, I know we're pretty much right up against time, but is there any questions from the group about what we covered today? All right, I'll take that as a no. So I definitely want to thank everyone for attending. These slides will be provided to y'all later, so that way you can attend. If you do have any future questions, obviously our contact information is here, and definitely feel free to reach out. Hopefully you got some useful information in regards to the changes that we talked through today. So once again, thank y'all for attending, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Thank you.